Yo, what's going on, guys? It's the Doc, and I know that this year is all about the wide receivers in the first round, but what if I told you the most important draft pick that you make this year is going to be your wide receiver 3 later in your drafts? I'm going to be going through 5 guys that I think could help you win your league this year. Let's get into it. All right, just like my previous comparison videos over the last few weeks, we got 5 major categories that we're going to be talking about for each one of these players: price, prior production, boom bust rate, their offense's potential, and some red flags that could affect their fantasy value going forward. All right, the first guy we're going to be talking about is Mike Evans. And from a price perspective, everyone in this video is going in or around the 6th round. Mike Evans is going as the wide receiver 34 right now in underdog drafts. In 2022, had a pretty solid year, 77 catches, 6 touchdowns, finished as the wide receiver 15 in points per game, and finished with 15 PPR points per game. So a pretty solid year. 2021, 114 targets, 74 catches, for 14 touchdowns, though. A lot of touchdown production for Mike Evans over the last 2 seasons. He was the wide receiver 12 in points per game in 2021, and he had 16.4 PPR points per game. So he's actually dropping from a production standpoint over the last 2 years. Now, from a boom bust rate standpoint, we're talking about Mike Evans as a player that we know is historically capable of winning you a week each and every week. You just have to make sure you're playing him on those weeks. Now, he has finished inside the top 12 in 8 of his last 34 games. That's a 24% boom rate. Now, from a bust perspective, though, he has finished outside of the top 36 wide receivers in 41% of his games over the last 2 years. So we can know that just from knowing Mike Evans as a player, he's got a lot of boom weeks, but he's also got a lot of bust weeks where he's really hurting your fantasy team. Now, from his offense's potential, this is where a lot of things have changed over the last year. Now, the Bucs were the 8th worst team in average points per game last year, but they were 1st in pass attempts per game. So will they continue to throw at the highest rate in the league? That's the question I have for Mike Evans this year. Now, Evans was 17th in targets last season among wide receivers, 37th in target share, and 11th in air yards, but he was 33rd in yards per route run, 35th in route win rate, and 47th in open rate. So he really wasn't getting open very well last season. The plan now this year is for him to move around more often in the offense. The new offensive coordinator in Tampa Bay wants more movement and easier throws for his receivers. Not exactly what you want to hear, because Mike Evans is statistically one of the better deep ball catchers in the NFL. So if they're going to be running a lot of stuff through quick throws to make it easier on these quarterbacks, Mike Evans could be somebody that takes a hit from a production standpoint. Now, red flag wise, we know that as he's getting older, he's becoming more of a boom bust player with his age. He is taking a significant downgrade at quarterback, but he has played with bad quarterbacks before. So it's possible that he could still have production, even though he's probably playing with one of the worst quarterbacks in his career thus far. Now, he also has a lot of target competition. Chris Godwin is still there. Rashad White is still there. Cade Otton, Russell Gage. There's a lot of guys that are going to have to be competing for targets that may be harder to come by now that Tom Brady is not the quarterback. But Mike Evans, still a very solid wide receiver and somebody you need to be considering in the 6th round of your drafts. All right, the second wide receiver that I want to talk about in this video is going to be Tyler Lockett. Now, Tyler Lockett is also going in the 6th round, currently being drafted as the wide receiver 31 in leagues. In 2022, solid year, 117 targets, 84 catches for 9 touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 18 in points per game, 14.8 PPR points per game last year. Now, 2 years ago, a little bit less in terms of target production, but he did still have 73 catches for 8 touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 20 and had 15.1 PPR points per game, so very consistent over the last 2 years in terms of production. Now, Lockett did have a boom bust rate that was one of the best of the group that we're going to be talking about today. He had top 12 finishes in 29 of his last 34 games. That's a 26% boom rate. And his bust rate outside of the top 36 was only in 12 of 34 games. So he's still busting about 35% of the time. But again, one of the better statistics from a boom bust rate in this group of wide receivers. Now, if we're talking about his offense's potential, probably the best offense heading into the year that we know on paper from last season. Now, the team was 9th in average points per game last year, but they were ranked 28th in red zone touchdown conversion rate. So he had a fair amount of touchdowns last year, but they could have been even better because his team was abysmal when they got into the red zone. Now, Lockett was second last year among all wide receivers in open rate. The dude just knows how to get open. It doesn't matter how old he's getting. He knows how to get open. And it was his third season now. This will be under Shane Waldron. It's the second year, though, that this team has run their offense through Geno Smith. We're hoping for another leap for the quarterback. Now, from a red flag potential standpoint, it is his age 31 season. And perhaps the biggest concern I have is that the team drafted what is likely his long-term replacement in Jackson Smith-Njigba, my number one wide receiver in this year's draft class, going to the Seahawks, going to be taking some opportunities from Tyler Lockett. And the question is when does that transition from Tyler Lockett kind of being the alpha in this group to JSN being the alpha in this group occur? Is it sometime this year? Is it next year? I think that's really going to depend on how I value Tyler Lockett moving forward in this year's fantasy landscape, and from a career perspective wise, what's going to happen with Tyler Lockett once JSN establishes himself as one of the best wide receivers coming out of the slot in the NFL. All right, the next guy that we're going to be talking about is Brandon Ayuk. Now, Brandon Ayuk is the most expensive player that we're going to be talking about today. He's currently going as the wide receiver 29 in best ball leagues, which is right around the 6th round, early 6th though. In 2022, he did have some decent production, his best year as a pro, 114 targets, 78 catches for 8 touchdowns. That was good for wide receiver 25 in PPR points per game. He had 13.4 PPR points per game over the course of last year. He had a down 2021. It was a rough year for the offense as a whole. 84 targets, 56 catches, 5 touchdowns, though, was the wide receiver 53. So from a production standpoint, Brandon Ayuk is the least proven of the guys that we've talked about in this video so far. Now, from a boom bust rate, Brandon Ayuk did have 6 finishes inside the top 12 over the last 2 years. That's an 18% boom rate. Not ideal when we're talking about over 20% for the first 2 guys. But again, Brandon Ayuk has not had the opportunity that those 2 guys have had. They're alphas in their offense. Brandon Ayuk so far has not been the number one target in his offense yet. Now, he has had quite a few games where he's busted. He's busting at about 50% of the time over the last 2 years. But mind you that most of those games came 2 years ago, not last year. So he did have a better year from a bust rate potential last year compared to 2 years ago, but we're comparing everybody apples to apples. He has not been as impressive from a bust standpoint. Now, moving on to his offense's potential, they were 6th in team average scoring last year, but they passed the 7th fewest times in the league. So the 49ers offense does score a lot of points, but they don't pass the ball a whole lot. The team finished the season last year with 33.5 points per game over the last 6 regular season games with Brock Purdy at quarterback, though. So there is some potential there for them to score a lot of points. Now, the team does have an inexperienced O-line, but Kyle Shanahan is still one of the best offensive coaches in the league, and Ayuk has improved his volume every year that he's played under Kyle Shanahan. So if he takes another bump up, he could be an incredible value for your fantasy team this year. Moving on to his red flags, Obviously, the biggest red flag with him is going to be who is throwing him the ball to start the season. Brock Purdy is on track to play week 1 so far, but he's coming off a major elbow injury. Trey Lance also coming off an injury. Who's going to be the quarterback for this elite 49ers offense? And there is a lot of target competition when we're talking about Brandon Ayuk. He's still got Deebo Samuel. You still got George Kittle. You still have Christian McCaffrey. Will Brandon Ayuk be able to ascend as the number 1 target in this offense this season? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves when we're talking about comparing him to the rest of these guys. If you guys are wondering where I'm getting the ADP data for this video, make sure you head on over to our friends at Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is the best platform for drafting, and everybody knows that drafting is one of the best parts of fantasy football. If you head on over to Underdog Fantasy, use the code HEADLINERS and deposit $10, we're going to send you a draft guide on us. It's a $22 value. You're getting it for just a $10 deposit with our friends at Underdog Fantasy, and you're also going to get entered to win the possibility of being able to pick something from Jake's office. Now, one person is going to win a prize from Jake's office, and let me tell you, I've been to Jake's office, and that place is a treasure trove. It's like walking into a museum of signed memorabilia. If you don't believe me, check out some of our other videos after you get done watching this one and look at Jake's office and tell me that you don't want to win something from that office. And as always, if you sign up for Underdog, there is a good chance that we will be running multiple drafts where you can compete against the fantasy headliners, and I'd love nothing more than taking your money. So if you want to try to beat me in fantasy football, Underdog is where it's going to happen this year. Make sure you use that code HEADLINERS when you sign up. But let's get back in to some wide receivers that you need to be drafting for your fantasy teams. All right, the next guy we're going to be talking about is Michael Pittman Jr., currently going as the wide receiver 32, again, in the 6th round of best ball drafts right now. Now, he was a target hog in 2022. 141 targets, 99 catches, but only 4 touchdowns, which had him finishing as the wide receiver 24 in points per game, only 13.5 PPR points per game last year. But he was a target monster again in 2021, 129 targets, 88 catches, 6 touchdowns, finished as the wide receiver 29 in points per game, 14 PPR points per game in 2021. So very consistent over the last 2 years. But we know one thing that we really love is the fact that he is getting peppered with targets regardless of who his quarterback is. 2 different quarterbacks over the last 2 seasons. Now, his boom bust rate, because of the lack of touchdown production, is not ideal. He has the lowest boom rate of any of the guys we're going to talk about in this video, only booming in 4 of his last 34 games. So he's going outside the top 12 in the majority of his games, only a 12% boom rate. Bust rate, on par with the rest of these players, 41% in 14 of his last 34 games. So he's right on par with a Mike Evans in terms of how often he busts, but he's not booming quite as often as a guy like Mike Evans or Tyler Lockett. Now, from an offense perspective, Pittman was elite in multiple categories last year. He was 18th in red zone targets, so he's getting some opportunity to catch touchdowns, but he's just not actually converting those at a clip that we want to see from an elite wide receiver. But he was the best in the league at total route wins. So when he ran a route, he beat his cornerback more than any other receiver in the league. Now, that doesn't mean he got the ball thrown to him. It just means he beat them when he was running that route. Anthony Richardson is arguably the best quarterback that he's ever played with, and the new head coach for the Colts does expect to take more shots down the field, which should open up more big play potential, more boom potential this year for a guy like Michael Pittman Jr. So we're kind of banking on the offensive schemes changing to maximize his potential down the field to get open and score some more touchdowns in the red zone with a more dynamic offense and a bigger arm at quarterback. Now, some of the red flags, while Richardson does have a huge arm, he isn't proven as an NFL passer. Can he make the touch throws that he needs to? I like to think that Richardson is going to love a guy like a Michael Pittman Jr. that can get open consistently and maybe take some of the pressure off Richardson throwing a perfect ball every single time. And we don't know what's happening with Jonathan Taylor. So this offense is going to be a little bit limited just by the fact that we don't know what's going to happen with that situation. If they're not starting Jonathan Taylor, the entire offense may have to change because they don't have an elite running back running with Anthony Richardson, taking some of the pressure off of him in those play action and those quarterback draws that you're looking for. Because if he doesn't have Jonathan Taylor in the backfield, Anthony Richardson really is the only threat that they have in the backfield, which should allow defenses to scheme more consistently just for Anthony Richardson, which would hurt Michael Pittman Jr. All right, the last wide receiver we want to talk about in this video is Marquise Brown. He's coming in as the wide receiver 33 in best ball right now, going in the 6th round, just like the rest of these guys. And in 2022, he had an up and down season, had 107 targets, 67 catches, 3 touchdowns, finished as the wide receiver 29 in points per game with 13 PPR points per game. 2021, he was a target monster, 146 targets, 91 catches, 6 touchdowns, finished as the wide receiver 28 in points per game with 14.1 PPR points per game. So even though he was a target monster, did not score a ton of fantasy points, just consistently above average week to week. Now, from a boom bust standpoint, Marquise Brown can really give you the goods. From a boom standpoint, he boomed in 7 of his last 34 games. That is a boom rate of 21%, which is right around where we're seeing the top guys from this group go. And about over 20% is pretty solid for your wide receiver 3. The problem is that Marquise Brown did bust in 50% of his games over the last 2 years. So when he doesn't boom, he is really hurting your fantasy teams. Not a lot of room for him to, consistently give you points each and every week. A lot of inconsistency there. Now, I will say that he did miss 5 games in 2022 due to injury. So because he missed 5 games, that is going to hurt him a little bit more. But just know that all 10 of the games that he busted in happened after the injury. So if through the first 6 weeks of the season when he was healthy, he did not bust once last year. So that is a good sign if we're talking about just his potential going forward. Now, speaking of potential, let's talk about his offense's potential. And Brown was the wide receiver 6 overall through the first 6 weeks of the season in 2022. We talk about it a lot, but he was on fire to start the year last year. The team was 4th last year in pass attempts per game. So the team as a whole passes the ball a ton. That's good for Marquise Brown. Now, the problem is that they were in the bottom 3rd in both passing touchdowns and in average points per game. So even though they're passing the ball a ton, they're not scoring a lot of touchdowns. We're hoping that will change this year. But the question is Kyler Murray healthy? It's the biggest red flag that we have for Marquise Brown, because without Kyler Murray in those games to finish the year, he averaged just 5.4 PPR points per game and 35 receiving yards a game. That is abysmal. He absolutely busted almost every single week that Kyler Murray was not his quarterback. So we have to know, what does Kyler Murray's health look like going into this year? Because Marquise Brown may be the most dependent player in the NFL on his quarterback's health in terms of a production standpoint. So I personally don't expect Kyler Murray to be back to start the year, but we're hoping to get him back earlier than projections, which would be maybe in week 4, 5, 6 versus week 2, 3. If he can come back sooner in the year, it's a good sign for Marquise Brown. But Marquise Brown isn't the only guy that I'm worried about. From an injury perspective, Kyler Murray and Marquise Brown both have injuries that are concerning to me heading into this year. Marquise Brown's injury history dates all the way back to college, where he had a foot injury. Foot injury hampered his year last year. Is the foot healthy? Is he healthy coming into the season? So far, reports say yes, but it's a big red flag that I have for him going forward, because his injury risk does lead to more bust weeks than most of these players. All right, so those are 5 wide receivers that I think could help you win your league as your wide receiver 3, but I know what you're thinking. Who would I be taking? Who is the guy that I like the most out of this group? And let me tell you, this was a tough decision for me. When I put it all on paper, when I compared them side to side, it's amazing how close all of these players are, but there's one guy that really stands out to me that has the most potential to make that leap into into elite wide receiver tier, and that is Michael Pittman Jr. Michael Pittman is one of the youngest players in this group. He also has shown over the last 2 years that he can be a target monster. His quarterback is vastly improved from last season. His offense should also be vastly improved with a new head coach that has orchestrated one of the best offenses in the league last year in the Eagles, now coming over to head coach this team. I do believe that Michael Pittman Jr. has the best chance to ascend into elite wide receiver 1 territory of this group. Everybody else has red flags. Everybody else has target competition. Michael Pittman is designed to be the alpha in this group. He's designed to be the alpha on his team, and I am betting on that volume turning into elite fantasy production, even though I am a little bit concerned that he's only boomed in 4 games over the last two years. I do think that Michael Pittman, if he can turn that into 4 or 5 games this year, you are going to be reaping huge benefits for your fantasy team. So Michael Pittman Jr. is going to win this competition, but I would not fault anybody for taking any of these guys as their wide receiver 3. So that's it for this week's video. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you've been watching my videos over the last few weeks, you know I've been giving away free Fantasy Headliners draft guides. If your name's up on the screen, congratulations, you won this week's draft guide. Make sure you email Jake at info@thefantasyheadliners.com to redeem your free draft guide. But let me know in the comments, how would you rank these 5 guys if you were drafting today? I want to know who you like, who you don't like, and is there somebody else in this range of wide receivers that you think could be a league winner? Let me know in the comments. I'll see you guys next week.